Hi everyone, this is Daryl and welcome back to Book Odyssey. In this video I'm reviewing Speaker for the Dead by Orson Scott Card. No human being, when you understand his desires, is worthless. No one's life is nothing. Even the most evil of men and women, if you understand their hearts, had some generous act that redeems them, at least a little, from their sins. Speaker for the Dead by Orson Scott Card, published in 1986, is the sequel to the military sci-fi modern classic Ender's Game, which saw Ender Wiggin commit unwitting xenocide against an alien race known as the Buggers. The book takes place around the year 5270, some 3,000 years after the events in Ender's Game. However, because of relativistic space travel at near-light speeds, Ender himself is only 35 years old. In the aftermath of the Bugger War, Ender disappeared with his sister Valentine, but Andrew Wiggin lives on, becoming a speaker for the dead, someone who seeks to speak the truth about deceased individuals as an occupation. Now, a second alien race has been discovered, the Piggies, or the Pequeninos, but again, the aliens' ways are strange and frightening, and again, humans die. It's only the speaker for the dead who has the courage to confront the mystery of these strange aliens and the truth. Speaker for the Dead won the Nebula Award in 1986 and the Hugo Award in 1987. There are a few worthy concepts that we can see in Speaker for the Dead, and I'll get to those, but it's in the themes, however, much like in Ender's Game, where Card really focuses his strength on the story. The first I want to touch on is warfare, because it's a theme that was also prevalent in Ender's Game. A video that I did a while back looked at some of the controversy that surrounded the book, and within that was many interpreting the book as being pro-war. Now, you can make up your own mind about that one, but it was interesting to note that a lot of the arguments for why Ender's Game was not a pro-war novel was because of the follow-up story set out in Speaker for the Dead. In fact, Card himself has always maintained that Speaker was the book he meant to write, and that Ender's Game was the book he had to write first. Unlike Ender's Game, there is no war in Speaker for the Dead, but there is the possibility of war. In fact, there are a few possibilities of war as we go through the story. At this point, we already have the fallout of the events in Ender's Game as the backdrop to show us the devastation that war can bring. Because of these brewing wars, some of them internal, it seems to me as though Card is attempting to depict peace as something you have to continuously work toward maintaining, rather than being the natural state of things. And I think that's the core of it. Ender's Game is about war, but Speaker for the Dead is about peace, the cost of keeping peace, redemption, forgiveness, and compassion. When you really know somebody, you can't hate them. Or maybe it's just that you can't really know them until you stop hating them. On the themes of redemption and forgiveness, we can see this most in Ender himself. He's still dealing with the fallout of the events that take place in Ender's Game when we return to his story in Speaker for the Dead. Not only the effects on humanity as a civilization, but also the emotional unrest that has plagued him in the long years since it happened. From a civilization point of view, people have changed, they've matured, and for a number of reasons have changed from thinking Ender as the hero that saved them to viewing him as a monster that acted out the xenocide of a species that wasn't actually a threat to them at all. We see the effect this has on Ender and how it has informed the direction of his life. He works towards redemption and forgiveness in all that he does, and importantly doesn't want anything like that to happen again. If anyone is looking to pick up Speaker for the Dead, thinking they're going to get Ender's Game 2.0 with space battles and everything that goes along with military sci-fi, they might be sorely disappointed. In this book, there are no aliens to defeat. The conflict comes from finding ways to live with aliens that are completely unlike humans. This also links to the theme of community and belonging, which Card talks a lot about, not only in this story, but in a few interviews that I've read. Community clearly means a lot to the writer, and it does show through in Speaker for the Dead. In fact, the whole theme of community is given several lengthy monologues in the story, which I have read a few critiques of the book label as simply mouthpieces for the author. They might have a point here, but as a theme it really works in the setting of the story. and while these could be interpreted as a little preachy, it made a certain sense for the characters, so it didn't take me too much out of the story personally. In terms of concepts, we have a few of note. Of course, there are the piggies to begin with. I won't go too much into these here, I'll save that for the spoiler part of the video, but on the whole I found Card's depiction of this species to be both endearing and unnerving at the same time. I've got no idea whether this was intentional, but for me the mystery that surrounded the piggies elevated the level of tension in the book, which was great. The concept of Jane was another intriguing one for me. Jane is a sentient being that resides in the connections of the Ansible network, which in itself is another great concept, being a device used for instantaneous communication across any distance. We see something similar in Ursula Le Guin's Hainish Cycle novels. The fact that this entity known as Jane resides in the connection of the Ansible network means she has nearly limitless access to the computers within the worlds, governed by the Starways Congress, and all the information contained within. Moving on to the characters and the writing, Speaker for the Dead is a much more adult read than Ender's Game. That's not to say that Ender's Game was written for children or young adults, it wasn't. Although children are the focus of the story, and I'm sure many kids and young adults have enjoyed reading it. But what I mean by this is that this is a more subtle book in a number of ways. It lacks the initial punch of plot that Ender's Game has, and it relies more on messages and characters to drive the story, which are much more nuanced, mature and considered. Now that Ender is older, he's gone through a transformation, a rebirth. The Ender from the first book is dead, and risen from the ashes is the Speaker for the Dead. Somehow this ancient man is able to see the truth, and it doesn't blind his eyes or drive him mad. I must listen to this voice and let its power come to me so that I can too stare at the light and not die. But with all its subtlety, Speaker for the Dead also has more overt messaging than I think Ender's Game did. Like I said before, you could interpret Speaker as being more preachy and more allegorical than Ender's Game. In fact, many have. And some have accused the characters as being simply mouthpieces for Card's opinions and philosophies. If the characters themselves were flat, I might have lent towards agreeing, but Card spends time developing his characters, so I personally don't think this is the case. There's a greater complexity of issues tackled in Speaker which are much deeper than those in Ender's Game, and I think that needs to be considered. The themes are more mature, the plot more character driven, and so those characters spend considerable time philosophizing various matters. What shouldn't really surprise anyone is the fact that Card's own opinions come through in the story. After all, he wrote it. I would suggest there isn't a single book written where the opinions and philosophies and ideas of the author are nowhere to be found. You might criticise Card for the way in which he puts across his ideas, but the distinction needs to be made that, in my opinion, you shouldn't criticise him for putting them across to begin with. The fact is that Card spends time developing his characters, and they are complex, and the book is as much about unravelling these characters as it is about unravelling what's happening in the plot, which in itself is pared back to make way for the exploration of the characters. One of the characters I found to be most compelling was Navinia. We see how grief, as well as a number of other factors, takes her from a fiery and determined youth to a woman who, in essence, has become her own worst enemy, making bad decision after bad decision, descending into a pit of self-pity, convinced she is getting exactly what she deserves. I imagine it feels like bathing in ice to the person touching her, but how does it feel to her? Cold as she is, it must surely burn like fire. Now I'm going to get into some of my spoiler thoughts, so as always, if you don't want to watch this part, you can skip ahead to the time at the bottom of the screen for my summary and star rating. I wanted to talk about a couple of things in a little more depth. One of those is the piggy's third life, and the other is whether the book actually condemns Ender's xenocide. On the third life of the piggies, which in essence sees them transform into a tree after death, is a clear metaphor for heaven. At least that's how I took it. While I enjoyed reading this part and enjoyed the concept of an animal somehow becoming a vegetable, or trees, on reflection it does feel a little bit on the nose. I'm also unsure about how I feel about these trees somehow magically producing all the items the piggies need. I know Arthur C. Clarke said any technology sufficiently advanced is distinguishable from magic, but I think this requires a greater leap of faith from the reader. Firstly, it's not technology, it's an organic life form, so unless there's something happening on a nano level, which it might, although it doesn't come up in the book, then I don't see how this could be possible. And secondly, it tends to suggest that the trees remained sentient after the piggy's death. How else would they know what to make? These elements required a heightened level of suspended belief from me, and while I enjoyed these parts while reading them, they were very well written, there's a niggle about the plausibility and blatant heaven parallel that makes the concept seem a little forced and a little contrived. On Ender's xenocide, does the Speaker for the Dead really condemn it? That's my question, and I admit that I don't really have a definite answer. I love a level of ambiguity in my books, so for me it's a bit of a Schrodinger's cat. It both does and doesn't depending on how you think about it. I only ask the question because so many point to Speaker as evidence that Ender's game, or card, is not militarist. We can say yes, Speaker does condemn Ender's xenocide because we can see how Ender regrets it, feeling a relentless remorse and guilt for what he had a hand in. We can see that he's been travelling the galaxy to find a home for the Hive Queen in order to attempt to redeem his actions. And we can see this in the text Ender wrote, which ultimately plays a hand in changing the collective opinion of humanity regarding the xenocide. In essence, Ender convinces humanity that xenocide was not needed. But does the book condemn the act of xenocide if it had been needed? Also, if we look at the tangible repercussions of the xenocide, there aren't really any at all. At least not for humanity or even for Ender. Yes, the name Ender Wiggin is synonymous with the xenocide and is condemned across the 100 Worlds, but Ender doesn't live as Ender Wiggin anymore, he lives as Andrew Wiggin, essentially avoiding the tangible fallout of his actions in the first book. Like I said, I'm still deciding on this, so I'd love to get your thoughts on this in the comments. Speaker for the Dead is a very different follow-up to Ender's Game. In a story that began drenched in war, Speaker instead looks at the cost of keeping peace, especially when those with whom you want to keep it are so different from yourself. It's a story of redemption, forgiveness, community and humanity, and deals with complex and mature themes, essentially having grown up from Ender's Game. If you're looking for Ender's Game Mark II, you may well be disappointed. But if you go into it with an open mind and allow Card to tell the story he always meant to write, you'll find it a compelling and meaningful read, even if that meaning can sometimes be a little obvious and, as some have put it, preachy. For me, however, this rarely detracted from my enjoyment of this unique and thoughtful story. With that in mind, I gave Speaker for the Dead 4.5 stars out of 5. So that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like the video to support the channel and subscribe if you haven't already if you want to see more videos from me. Until next time guys, happy reading.